Hello, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming out tonight. My name is Medina Tarlak, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors and the International Expert Team for the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada. The Institute for Research of Genocide Canada is a public scientific institution engaged in the analysis of crimes against peace, crimes of genocide, and other breaches of international law. The goal of the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada is to establish a permanent basis for the development of our abilities to detect, identify, prevent, and punish the crime of genocide. At the same time, another major goal is to raise its voice against genocide and send a message that will influence and affect the consciousness of the world's leaders in order to save humanity and civilization, preserve the human values, human freedoms, human rights, and lives of small, weak, and powerless groups, human communities, and nations. A large portion of the work done within the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada is to bring to light the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity that occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1991 and 1995. Recent evidence states that 500,000 people originating from Bosnia and Herzegovina living in North America were expelled from their homes during the aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they are victims of numerous and various forms of crimes against humanity and international law. After Bosnia, the international community said never again. But unfortunately, it is happening again in Myanmar against the Rohingya people. We are trying to raise awareness on the events that unfolded and are continuing to unfold in order to increase public pressure onto the Canadian government to address the issue. So at this moment, I'd like to introduce Amanda and Christina from Amnesty International at UTM to speak a bit about their role at UTM within Amnesty International and their goals of raising awareness. So, round of applause. Yeah.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I'm Amanda, I'm Vice President of Amnesty at UTM. I'm sure most people here have heard of Amnesty, but I would just like to go over what we do for those who aren't aware. Amnesty International is a not-for-profit, apolitical organization that aims to protect and defend human rights around the world. We have journalists and researchers on the ground in areas where human rights abuses are taking place. Their job is to investigate and expose the facts wherever abuses happen. Through various campaigns and petitions, we lobby governments, ensuring that they keep their promises and respect international law. Thanks to the wide global support for Amnesty's work, demonstrated by the regional offices in over 70 countries and the smaller divisions of the organization, such as the one here at Amnesty UTM, Amnesty is able to mobilize millions of supporters around the world to campaign for change and to stand in defense of activists on the front line. We help those affected by these abuses to claim their own rights through education programs and training. To talk more about our work here on campus, I would like to give the floor to my friend and colleague, Christina Cocker.
Thank you, Amanda, for that welcoming introduction, and I'd like to personally thank you all on behalf of Amnesty once again for coming out to our event, because the media hasn't been covering this issue as much as it should have, and we believe that it's something worth talking about, and we'd like to thank our special guests tonight for coming out and helping us learn to make change. So our division of Amnesty is primarily focusing on raising awareness and petitioning for global issues. We will be having 4 main campaigns running this year, and globally we will be focusing on the democratic instability in Eastern democracies, and we hope to combat issues such as homophobia and voter suppression. We also have our Human Rights Defender campaign, which this is an example of an event we're running for it. And again, we hope to raise awareness and petition for the release of those who have been wrongly imprisoned. We are also, while we are concerned with issues on the global stage, we also care deeply for the issues here at home. So we are going to be focusing on the Indigenous Right campaign, which me and Amanda will personally be spearheading. And if you have any questions about it, we would love to talk to you after the event. We'll be focusing on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and the Site C Dam. And finally, our last campaign will be Right for Rights, in which we, the people, are taking the issues that are happening around the world and bringing it close to home. We are going to be writing letters, petitioning, and we are going to be encouraging our students to take point in taking initiative to write these letters to political leaders and to people around the world to say that we are thinking of you and that we do want to make a change. Again, on behalf of Amnesty, we would like to thank you all for coming, and we hope you find this very informative. And if you have any questions or concerns after, we would love to speak with you. Thank you once again.
speaker for tonight is Zishan Shabazz. Zishan Shabazz is an international past member of the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada. He is also the author of the paper, Betrayal of Bosnia by the United Nations and the World Community, which was published by the IGC. Zishan is also the co-founding member of the Institute of Higher Reasoning, which is a think tank that promotes compassionate and rational thinking. At this point, I'd like to welcome Zishan up to the podium.
Thank you, Medina.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I will start by quoting the Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. Rape is used in my country as a weapon against those who only want to live in peace, who only want to assert their basic human rights. Especially in the areas of ethnic nationalities, rape is rife. It is used as a weapon by armed forces to intimidate the ethnic nationalities and to divide our country. This was in 2011. Let's fast forward to this month. According to Pramila Patten, who is a special UN representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, she said sexual violence is being commanded, orchestrated, and perpetrated by the armed forces of Myanmar. She also said that brutal acts of sexual violence had occurred in the context of collective persecution that included the killings of adults and children, torture, mutilation, and the burning and looting of villages. She continues, the widespread threat and use of sexual violence was a driver and push factor for forced displacement on massive scale and a calculated tool of terror aimed at the extermination and removal of the Rohingya as a group. She goes on to say the forms of sexual violence we consistently heard from the survivors include gang rape by multiple soldiers, forced public nudity and humiliation, and sexual slavery in military captivity. One survivor was in captivity for 45 days by the Myanmar army. Now, this reminds me, based on the research I did on Bosnia, the same thing was happening there as well by the aggressors against the Bosnians. And I wonder if either the Burmese army took their playbook from the aggressors of Bosnia or vice versa. Also, since the first mass influx of refugees in Bangladesh in August, gender-based violence specialists had delivered services to 1,644 survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And according to the UN, although this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada, which I am a part of, have been forthright in our calls to action for our respective state actor, which is the Canadian government. But before I share some of our calls to actions, me and my colleagues have also been in touch with activists discussing this very pressing matter. And one of those activists is Noam Chomsky, and he told me he wanted me to share these words with you here at the conference. So Noam Chomsky stated, quote, "The brutal assault against the Rohingya is one of the most shocking atrocities of the current period. Every effort must be made to bring these hideous crimes to an end and to ensure that the people who have suffered so miserably be protected from further harm and guaranteed decent conditions of life." Now, going back to the call of actions, one of the call of actions that the IGC had come out with, and which was sent to the government, actually in a personal letter to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was a demand to revoke the honorary Canadian citizenship of Aung San Suu Kyi. This was on September 14th, 2017. And then on September 30th, 2017, we released another call to action, and I'll just actually read it out. "We, the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada, are urging civil society in Canada that if you care for your fellow human beings, what you care for yourselves, then urgently request your Member of Parliament to send the Canadian Armed Forces to assist in preventing further genocide of the Rohingya community in Myanmar. We reason if the CAF, which is the Canadian Armed Forces, can send its forces to the Caribbean to help provide relief for victims of Hurricane Irma, which it had done, then there's all the more reason to send the CAF to help stop genocide of an entire people. Now, in terms of intervention, which is logically required in this case to halt the brutalization of an entire people and provide assistance and security to the over 600,000 who have fled from the persecution, the UN continues to sit on its hands. To end my part, I'm going to end it with a quote by Dr. Zarni. And Dr. Zarni, I'm not co-opting your speech. The UN has been quote, I'm quoting Dr. Zarni, quote, "The UN has been a failure since the end of the Second World War. Every case of genocide, the UN has failed," end quote. And to this I say, there has to be a better way. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Ahmed from the Burma Task Force, who also has a few words to say. At this moment, I welcome Ahmed to the podium.
Well, thank you all for coming here today. Special thanks to Zishan and
Nadeem.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something. Yeah, Nadeem.
And Medina.
And Nadeem, to discuss this very important topic. My name is Ahmed Ramadan. I work for the Burma Task Force. We've been working on this issue for the past or over 4 years now. And before this, we had the Bosnian Task Force, the Kosovo Task Force, and now we're working on the Burma Task Force. We are not a relief organization. We do advocacy and education, and we've launched a few campaigns, including before the August 25th attacks, an anti-rape campaign. I have some booklets if anybody's interested. Some of the young women that wanted to share their stories of, and let the world know what happened to them. So if anybody wants any of those, I can pass them on. And then since August 25th, we've been very active, obviously, on trying to stop the genocide that's taking place inside of Burma. And we believe that Canada could play a very important role, and they have been one of the most vocal countries in regards to words. Unfortunately, the more talk that's done and no action that's taking place, the more emboldened the Burmese military is becoming. And you see every wave of attack that happens is getting worse every time. So in October of 2016 till about March, you saw 90,000 people flee during that time. Now in 3 months, we had over 600,000 people flee across the border. So this requires real action, and we've been actually focused on asking the government for 4 main points, which is 1, declare it what it is, which is a genocide, and Dr. Maung will speak a little bit about that, considering he's a genocide scholar. The second point we've been asking for our government is to invoke the Genocide Treaty, and in addition, Canada's the home of R2P, and we're the main nation that pushed for the responsibility to protect. And this is a situation where it definitely falls under that category, where a minority needs defending from a government that is not willing to protect its own citizens. So that's the second point. The third thing we're asking for is the refugee camp, or as Dr. Zarni has been calling it, I'm going to start using that term from now on, but as these genocide survivors that have crossed the border into Bangladesh, there's 1 million of them. It's complete chaos in the refugee camps. So they need serious help, not just with aid, but with coordination and logistically. And again, this is where Canada can step in and help reach the more remote areas in these survivor camps. And the fourth point is sanctions against the country. And although sanctions move slower and won't stop the genocide that's taking place immediately, it still sends a signal that Burma is being viewed as a nation that is committing genocide and ethnic cleansing, and they are not worth, or they are not the kind of country that Canada wants to do business with or be associated with. So these are the 4 points that we've been asking for. I do have some handouts that I'll try to get around to everybody. Another program that we've been working on inside the camps is we've been rehabilitating some of the rape victims, specifically the teenage girls that have gone through rape there, gang rape and that kind of thing. Also documenting some of the survivors' stories, keeping track of perpetrators and people that have been involved in, village burning and killing and those sort of unfortunate situations that they've come out of. So these are a few things that we've been working on, including pressuring our government to take more meaningful steps, speak out, and hopefully intervene and save the remaining 40% of the villages that are still standing right now, although we don't know, the Rohingya, the 200,000 to 300,000 that are still stuck inside their exact circumstance. A lot of them are stuck in mountains and in jungles, surrounded by dead bodies. They have no access to health care and aid. So, although the refugee situation is serious and critical, the genocide is taking place inside of Burma. We've been trying to focus on that and hopefully, be able to save the people that are still surviving. I don't want to take up too much of your time because it's really important to hear from our special guests. But thank you all for coming, and I'll make sure to get you guys some of our information before you leave. Thank you.
I'd like to share a few words about Dr. Maung. Dr. Maung is a genocide scholar and a longtime Burmese human rights activist. Maung is a non-resident research fellow with the Documentation Center of Cambodia. He has organized international conferences on the plight of Rohingyas at the London School of Economics, Harvard University, Norwegian Nobel Institute, and Oxford University, and initiated the Permanent People's Tribunal on Myanmar. He taught sociology of education at National Louis University in Chicago, and he has held learning, research, leadership, and visiting fellowships at the Rockefeller Foundation, Georgetown, UCL, Institute of Education, Oxford, LSE, University of Malaya, University of Brunei, and Harvard. Maung holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and an MA from the University of California at Davis. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Maung.
Good evening, everybody. It's Friday evening, and it shows that you're genuinely concerned about this topic. And thanks so much for coming here to spend an hour or so hearing about some of the horrific things that have been going on, not just over the last 6 months, but the last 39 years. So I will, in the course of my talk tonight, walk you through different waves of genocidal terror, and also the reason. There's always a rationale, justification for whatever types of atrocities. In the healthy, normal mind, it is inconceivable that we would harm even a little chicken or a dog, like acts of cruelty, even to animals. It takes tremendous amount of mental acrobatic to try to harm people, not just individuals, but entire community, large numbers, or even if it's not a large number, even if it is a single neighborhood, it takes tremendous amount of twisted, mental process to justify the harm that humans engage in towards a particular community. So, what I'd like to do tonight is maybe to tell just a few stories first, because whether we call ourselves human rights activists or concerned individuals regarding human rights, civil liberties, or as human rights scholars or analysts, we tell stories. An analysis is, particularly human analyses about human communities, are not cut and dry. They're not, so we're not talking about physics or rocket science or mathematical equations. We are concerned with the plight of communities, not individuals. I think a lot of you who work on genocide know, if individuals are harmed, they are harmed because of their membership to ethnic, racial, religious, or national community group, their membership. So our concern is the plight of entire communities. the reason I want to tell stories is by hearing stories, I got interested in this issue and became personally very concerned. Because I grew up in Burma. I spent like 25 years of my the first 25 years of my life there was college educated. I left the country almost 30 years ago, back in 1988, before the country erupted into a series of peaceful pro-democracy uprisings. Many of the dissidents today, or many of the former dissidents who were jailed in the last, say, like 28, 29 years, they were at the forefront of the fight for human rights and the fight for democratization. And yet when it comes to this issue, 99% of the Burmese dissidents, what you might call like human rights defenders, journalists who spend years behind bars fighting for press freedom, they are now part of this genocidal process. Cheerleading, whitewashing, dismissing, denying. And Aung San Suu Kyi is just the most famous, or now the most infamous one out of this whole generation, or even like 2 generations of Burmese dissidents. So I lived there for 25 years before I came to the US back in 1988. So in those 25 years, I never heard the word Rohingya. And even, well into my, say, first decade, as a student in first California and later at Wisconsin, I was not, put it this way, I was oblivious to both the terminology or the ethnic name Rohingya and the plight, the persecution that they have endured. And it just shows how effective the propaganda in Burma has been. Because we've been under essentially military rule since 1962. So that's a year before I was born, and I was born in 63. And the military have had monopoly and now near monopoly control over schools. That means what students read, what they've been taught, history or other subjects, insofar as the Burmese human geography or ethnic histories are concerned. And the military has been able to dictate what to think about the Rohingyas, how to think about them, or whether they exist as an ethnic community or not. So, the impact of this level of propaganda was, me in my earlier incarnation, where I was utterly oblivious to the fact that there was a community called Rohingya, and they were part of our country. They were full citizenships before we were born, and that they have been stripped off their ethnic identity, their history erased from history textbooks, public discourses, the media. And so that kind of totalitarian propaganda has tremendous impact on what people think about Rohingya, how people feel about Rohingya. So when you read newspaper articles today, you will see a standard line: Rohingyas are not welcome, or there is tremendous and palpable racism and dislike and rejection of Rohingyas because they've been betrayed as essentially unwelcome British colonial era agricultural seasonal workers who crossed the border from present-day Bangladesh. But in those days, we're talking about 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, when the first British annexation began. Because Burma was colonized in 3 different stages, beginning in 1826, when the first Anglo-Burmese war finished, and we, the Burmese, lost the war, and British snatched the Arakan coastline. And so, so I learned about the fact that they exist, and they existed as an ethnic community of Burma, and they were full citizens, and they were contributing to what we might call today nation building in a post-independence Burma from 1948 onward, through stories. That's why I want to tell you stories. But I learned these stories that they were our people, and that they have suffered tremendous and unspeakable atrocities through my wife. And I did not choose to be a genocide scholar. As an undergraduate, I studied chemistry and physics. In California, my interest shifted towards essentially education, politics, sociology, because my country was undergoing the tremendous upheaval. So I wanted to be involved, and so so my heart was in the political affairs and activism. So I gradually drifted towards social sciences. And I trained as essentially a sociologist of education. I trained teachers. I trained to write or develop a curriculum for the pre-college level education. And my wife began to work at a small legal research firm called Equal Rights Trust, based in London. And the Equal Rights Trust focused on promoting and defending the rights of, say, marginal communities, like gay, lesbian communities, Roma, in the old language we call it gypsies, but that's no longer a respectable or acceptable term, so we don't use the term gypsy, like the Roma people in Europe. And one of the projects that the Equal Rights Trust took on was the plight of the Rohingyas. This was back in 2009, 2010, so almost like 8 years. So only around that time did I become aware, through the fact that my wife was brought home reports from, say, Amnesty International or like UNHCR or other rights or humanitarian organizations. And at dinner table, just as she would tell me what she was reading, and she said, "Look, like your country is doing these things to this community." And I started reading. And first I was a bit incredulous, and then I stumbled on the fact that one of my close relatives, my grandfather's younger brother, was the deputy commander of the Rakhine or Arakan coastline. This was back in the 1950s and early 60s, when the Burma Army and the entire parliamentary democratic government embraced the Rohingya as our own, one of our own ethnic communities, despite the fact their faith is Islam. And then Burma started out as a multiculturalist, a very tolerant and open country upon independence. And the head of the armed forces was a member of a minority ethnic group called Karen. And he was Christian. He was trained at Sandhurst. And one of the earliest, or actually the very first ambassador that Burma sent to the United States was a gentleman by the name of James Barrington. Well, it doesn't sound like a Burmese name, but for all intents and purposes, he was Burmese, despite the fact that he had a Eurasian, ethnic ancestry. So from that secularist, multiculturalist Burma to today, Burma we are seeing is a Burma that wants to make life miserable for non-Buddhists. They want to purify and restore Burma into what they consider the original pure Buddhist state. Similar to what's happening today in India. And some of you may be aware that the Prime Minister Modi has a base that wants to rename India Hindustan. India for only Hindus. And so that in India they're starting to talk about citizenship based on Buddhism and Hinduism. And like welcoming people from across, say, Bhutan, Nepal, Burma, Bangladesh, who are Hindu and Buddhist. And while they're trying to save the cows out of their religious belief and attack the Muslims that eat the meat. And so about 2 weeks ago I went to Bangladesh and I came back with stories. And 2 stories I'm going to tell you. Extremely horrific, because I'm a father of 2 girls. One's 18 and the other one is 8. And so I met about 24 survivors. And the Bangladeshi government calls them forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals, because Bangladesh wants to make sure that the responsibility to look after these, what I call survivors, lies squarely with the Burmese government. And, fair enough. But the Bangladesh government doesn't want to use the word refugee. They don't classify them as refugees. So 1 million forcibly displaced Burmese Myanmar nationals. What that means is 1 million survivors. That's the number of people that were gassed or that perished at Auschwitz. 1 million people we're looking at in extremely miserable conditions. The perpetrating country, Burma, my own country, obviously is guilty of the genocidal terror. The host country wants to boot them out as fast as possible. And they just signed a deal, repatriation deal yesterday, despite the fact that the Rohingya villages are still burning. And so when I went there in refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, which is across from the Burmese border, I met 24 men and women. The youngest was a 10-year-old boy who got shot in the leg. He showed me his bullet wound as he ran. The soldiers shot him. So luckily he survived, and he showed me where the bullet went and where the bullet came out. And you could still see a semi-fresh wound. And about 12 survivors of sexual violence, and 2 women, their story stood out. They told me, and I asked them, if I could take a picture. They said no problem. And then some of them wear the veil, and they lifted up. They said they've been humiliated publicly. They were all stripped naked. And one of the things that they told me was that in this camp, meaning where they are in the refugee or survival camp, there are no beautiful women left, because all the beautiful women were raped and killed. And so they consider themselves less beautiful. And so being less beautiful, it seemed, retrospectively, they felt being not beautiful, attractive, seems like a blessing, because some of them were, did not face the death. But one young woman, 18-year-old, holding a little baby, she described how she was raped to me, face to face, with other women. It's through an interpreter. Some of them, speak some Burmese, and most of them don't have the command of language, because they've been quarantined from the mainstream Burmese-speaking society for nearly 39 years. So, they don't have the at a Burmese language facility. I'm not showing her face out of respect. This is a pair of hands of this young woman whom I interviewed. If you would, I don't know if you noticed, there's one finger missing. And the way, that is how she was showing me. The soldiers tied her hand, lifted above her head as others ripped her clothes off. And she was at the time, this attack again on her happened in the earlier wave of attacks back in 2012. And she was at the time only 13, a teenager. And so a teenager, so with strength and, out of fear, she attempted to untie herself. So she bite the rope, tried to untie it. It's like Hollywood, movie where like the torture, the bad guys were doing bad things. And so because that was seen by the soldiers, rightly so, as an act of resistance, so they pulled her hands or arms down, put it on a hard surface, a table or a floor, and one soldier cut one fingertip, and then they proceeded to gang rape her. That's one story. The second story, even more horrific. And then that young woman, the teenager, survived, and she's now she now has a 1-year-old baby with her husband, and she's widowed because she saw her husband like shot dead in front of her eyes as they were running. And she's 18 now. And the other woman, survivor that I interviewed, and she said as she heard the military trucks arrived at her village, the villages would have like dirt road, depending on the sizes of the villages. So military convoys arrived, and then she started hearing like automatic gunfire as the soldiers, troops started shooting indiscriminately. And so her father ran, she ran, and then she ran to the nearest little woods, not that far from the house, because her younger sister, 16 years old, and this woman, the second woman that I'm talking about now, she's in her mid-20s. She described her little sister, 16 years old, a high school final student, because in Burma we only have 10 years in grade school, kindergarten, and then like 1 to year 10. So we don't have year 12 like here or in US or UK. So this high school final year girl, 16-year-old, she was dragged by a group of soldiers into their house. So I suppose that they were fairly well-off family who ran a little grocery shop in the village. So like there were windows through which she could see what was happening inside the house. She said like she saw her little sister dragged by the soldiers into the house when she was hiding from behind little trees. And her father, who initially ran for his life, heard the scream of his younger daughter. And she said he turned around and ran back to the house where the sound, his daughter's scream was coming from. And as he ran towards the house, the soldiers shot him in the back. So the old man fell down on the village ground, not far from their house. And the skull was, obviously blown open. And one soldier, Burmese soldier, wearing a red scarf, indicating that he was part of the special force unit, he bent over and stick his fingers into his brains that were already scattered, and picked it up and tossed it to the free-range chickens roaming in the village yard. this is not simply, a state actor, a government troops, trying to terrorize the people or scare the people into running and just simply grabbing the land. Yeah? This is like sadism, of the most extreme kind. And even the crime writers would not be able, this is more like a Silence of the Lamb type, complete horror movie. Even in our wildest imagination, how many of us in this room could come up with this kind of imagination? Even if we're doing a creative piece of writing, for the effect, we could not simply bring ourselves. It is not simply unspeakable. When people say Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or others, politicians like speak on camera and say unspeakable crimes. No. These are unimaginable crimes that are being committed. As a father of two young girls, or one's a woman now in college, I put myself in the shoes of that old man who got shot and his brain got fed to the chicken as the younger daughter was assaulted and killed. And so I think we need to understand that I'm sure these soldiers did not know the names of their victims. And that these are not isolated incidents. That's why, as the genocide scholar here described quoted the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Hundreds. I think so far, 1,600 women of different ages have been recorded or identified as sexual violence victims. But that's a small number because uncountable number of women and girls have been raped and killed. That's the best way of silencing these victims. They could no longer tell. So, quote unquote, the ugly ones, who survived, they would tell these stories. The beautiful ones were raped and killed. And so that is what actually shook me to the core, because I am a member of Burmese Buddhist dominant community, and these atrocities are or have been committed in my name. And when I first walk into the room at the International Organization of Migration, there's a small little a brick house in this refugee camp where there are literally hundreds of thousands of people are essentially lingering or languishing. I could not bring myself to say a single word, because nothing had prepared me for this face-to-face encounter with the survivors of the crime that my own community has been committing, both the government and the other local Rakhine vigilantes who wanted to reclaim this area, the Arakan coastline, as and then restore it to what they consider, according to their radical revisionist historical vision, pure Buddhist land. I am Buddhist. I am Burmese. And so basically my eyes just swelled up, and I lost the ability to make any utterances orally. And after a few minutes, I was able to recompose myself, and I told the interpreter, who's a Rohingya refugee who grew up in Bangladesh and became an educated teacher and a lawyer. I said, "Can you please tell them that I am Burmese, I am Buddhist, and I am very, very sorry." That's all I could say, and that's all I said before the interview began. And they could tell that I was, I was real. I was genuine when I said, they could tell that essentially I was crying. And so, because of these types of stories that I've this was the very first time in my life that I heard firsthand from the survivors. But before that, I was reading Amnesty International reports, human rights reports, like UNHCR reports and other human rights documentation, units have come up with. But in those days, we're talking about 2008, 2009, this issue had not hit the international headlines yet. And so I started doing research on this issue myself, although I was not trained in genocide studies or mass atrocities, nor was I trained as a legal scholar or practitioner. And so my wife and I collaborated on a 3-year study while she was still working for the Equal Rights Trust. And then we moved from London to Brunei where I was teaching and I was developing a research program on South China Sea, because that's one of the hottest topics, because China and different UN member states in the region that claim to have claim over South China Sea. And so my professional life, my professional job had nothing to do with mass atrocities. But as I started digging, I realized that the extent to which these heinous crimes have been committed, and committed systematically and over almost 40 years. And that's, I imagine many of you are under 30s, and 10 years before you were born, these crimes have been committed, and they continue to be committed today. Think about it. 20 years, 30 years is a long time, growing up. And this is a community that has been persecuted for almost 2 generations. That's why I make a point of telling people that Hitler only had about 15 years to pursue his fascist vision. And my country, particularly the military, has been afforded by the so-called international community 4 decades to commit a slow-burning genocide. And they are still getting away with it. And so out of that study, we published the first study that looked at the plight of the Rohingya and the persecution using the genocide framework. So, until that point, most human rights organizations document, laundry list of rights violations, and no one had put this in a, international legal or sociological framework of genocide. And so we've done that, and that was 2014. And I started speaking out on this issue. My employer, the University of Brunei, it is a very wealthy, small Malay Islamic sultanate, part of Borneo. Borneo is the 3rd largest island in the world, and Brunei was more interested in doing business with the quote-unquote Buddhist military, because we have one of the largest natural gas deposits in the world. And so Brunei is also natural gas-based economy. So the Burmese embassy pressured the Brunei Foreign Ministry, government officials and whatnot, starting to say that what I was writing or what I was talking about the Rohingyas, just these are non-existent people, and he is just smearing the Burmese military, trying to tarnish the country's image. And so the Sultanate wanted me to shut up. And finally, I was called in by one of the influential administrators, essentially saying, I can publish if I want in the academic journals, but I must not be speaking to the media. I must not be talking to the public about this issue. So I was there. I was supposed to be there on a 3-year contract, and then that. If I like it, if they like me to keep me, we renew the contract. So on New Year's Day, a year after I arrived there, almost a year after I arrived there, I basically packed up and got on the plane, flew to Kuala Lumpur, and once I got to at the Kuala Lumpur airport, I sent the resignation letter from there because I broke the contract. So I didn't want to inform them before I left, and so in other words, I resigned and there, and then in Malaysia. I was able to do what I wanted to do, which was completely focus on the genocide of the Rohingya. But my family and I, at the time, my younger daughter is only about 3 years old. We came under serious death threats, so we were living in a government, our friend's house as a safe house, and the government would provide essentially protection. If I wanted to go out and have a coffee or go do a little bit of grocery shopping, I have to text them where I'm going so that they could alert the people. Sometimes I have to take 2 or 3 taxis to make sure that no one followed me straight to where we were living. So anyway, it isn't about me, and so let me just continue talking about this issue. One of the few things that are key to justifying, or the justification that the military gives to the public, to the world, is that Rohingyas are fake ethnic people. They never existed in Burma. And as I said, the government told the public that the Rohingyas came to Burma only as part of the British colonial rule, as agricultural seasonal workers, whose descendants are no longer welcome. And the Burmese want them to go back to Chittagong, which is the border district across from the Burmese border. And here what we are looking at is, one of the most important primary sources that support the Rohingyas' claim that they have been there for generations, and in this case for a couple of centuries. But one generation should be enough to entitle any migrants, even if they were migrants, for full citizenship right, equal protections. You can understand it. A country like Canada or USA, these are countries built on immigrants and immigrant energy and labor, despite shortcomings. And so we are dealing with the official narrative that is very popular with the Burmese public, that rests on a single lie, that these people don't exist. They are not who they are. They are not who they say they are. So the genocide scholars would know Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer and legal activist who coined the term genocide back in the 1930s. The identity is so crucial to any analysis of genocide. Genocide actually begins on the assault on the identity of the group. It did not start with troops spraying bullets or like vigilantes, like, beheading people in large number or significant number. It starts with the erasure of a group's identity, stripping off their right to identity and their identity. That's why it's so important. The second element is that after the genocidal acts were completed or substantially completed, the perpetrator will put them in a situation where the survivors have to accept a new, social order. That is why, if you look at the, Germany in 1933, I think in 1935 September, there was a mass Nazi rally in the Nazi headquarters in Nuremberg, in Bavaria. Nuremberg is not, maybe an hour train ride from Munich. Now that was, Nazi party's stronghold, the whole Bavaria. That the state that gives the world BMWs. The Nazi Party rally announced the Nuremberg racial laws that de-Germanized, nationalized the entire German Jewish community. And Jews have been there in Europe for thousands of years. And of course, there have been a widespread anti-Semitism across what was called Christendom, Christian Europe, because the Jews were seen as Christ killers. And so the prejudice against the Jewish community across Europe was quite widespread and deep, but it was not until the Nazi Party came to power, not until the Nazi ideology was adopted by the German state, the Third Reich, that anti-Semitism, the racism against the German Jewry, turned into a genocidal ideology. So that is why the second thing that we will also be told by both the Western press, policymakers, as well as the Burmese officials, is that there is an anti-Rohingya and also anti-Muslim racism in the country that goes back to 100 years during the colonial time. But we must not be fooled by this discourse of, well, this is a long, decades-long prejudice or racism. Yeah? And so this cannot be undone overnight. That's why when Aung San Suu Kyi said, well, look, this country has been under military rule for half a century, and you cannot expect a new democratic government that still does not have a full control over all the organs of the state to address this problem overnight. That is an excuse, because it is not the society that was leading this genocide. It was the state. It was the military. The military had effectively mobilized people's fears and prejudices. So there is an actor that is manipulating people's feelings, instilling in the public fear and loathing of Rohingyas in particular, and Muslims in general. So these two things are related. People will say oh no, this is illegal immigration issue because the Burmese public view them as illegal migrants from Bangladesh. No, they are connected. I'll tell you how they are connected. Burma is surrounded by 5 different countries: China, India, Thailand, Laos, and Bangladesh. And then we've got a long, over 1,000 miles coastline in the Bay of Bengal, and that connects to the Andaman Sea and then onto the Indian Ocean. Only with reference to the borders with the Muslim Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the most populous countries in the world, most densely populated, over 160 million people, about maybe like 1/3 or half the size of Burma's landmass. We use the terminology gate. It's like Burma, the country, it's like a Trumpish, ideology. We have to build a wall. So they don't see, like the Trump talks about walls only towards Mexico, along the borders with Mexico. Donald Trump doesn't talk about the wall, between Canada and USA. It is quite interesting. You think about it. I mean, maybe this is related to the fact that the Mexico economy is a lot a lot less developed than the Canadian economy. So maybe like a money or class issue. But in our case, it is a religious issue, because we share over 1,000 miles long borders with China, and we also share slightly shorter borders with India Northeast, like Manipur, Assam, and those places, if you've got that geography in your mind. We don't use the word, like Eastern Gate, or Northern Gate, or Southern Gate, with respect to Thailand, China, India. And then with Thailand, we have about 500, 600 miles long borders. With Bangladesh, we only have 170 miles long border, really short, compared with the other borders. We use the word Western Gate. And then because the boundaries were drawn up only after the Second World War, after the dissolution of the British colonial rule, these are fictional. These Rohingyas are one of the communities that people like James Scott from Yale, who looked at the Southeast Asia history from an anarchist perspective, anti-state perspective. The boundaries are fictional. Communities are real. And these borderland communities, they settle across these new nations. And they have ties, linguistic, cultural, historical, commercial, geographic, demographic ties with communities in other parts. And so Rohingyas are no different from other ethnic communities that we find along the Burmese borders. But what is different is Rohingyas are Muslims. We have 17 different types of Muslims in Burma. And they're all scattered, and many of them are well integrated or very much exposed to the Burmese mainstream society in the middle. Of the 17 different Muslim communities, only Rohingyas have a single geographic concentration. And they were once given their own administration, civil administration, placed under the Ministry of Defense. And my late great-uncle was deputy chief of the predominantly Rohingya district called Maung. Maung is the name of the river along which the Rohingyas settle. And so that's why this genocide becomes so personal. And my late great-uncle was deputy chief of Rohingya district at the time when the Burmese military and the government embraced the Rohingyas as part of our people, community, part of Burma's ethnic tapestry. So from there, from the space where the Rohingyas were given full citizenship, full recognition of their ethnic heritage and linguistic, and they were allowed actually a slot, official slot, on the sole national broadcasting program. In those days, we didn't have television. Television did not arrive in Burma until 1970s. I'm talking about around 1960s. Rohingyas were allowed to broadcast in their own language 3 times a week, 30 minutes each slot. They were allowed to, serve in the most sensitive areas of the state, security forces. And so they were able to establish the claim that they have been fully fledged citizens of Burma by any standards. And yet, in 1982, the Burmese military leadership passed a law by decree that essentially was aimed at stripping Rohingyas of any legal basis for citizenship in 1982. And those laws, unlike Nuremberg laws, did not mention the word race or ethnicity. It used the year of the First Anglo-Burmese War, 1824, as the cutoff year for natural citizenship, people born into citizenship. And so that was designed jointly by the Rakhine nationalists who shared this same Arakan coastline as their ancestral land with the Rohingyas. Rohingyas have always been outnumbered by the Rakhine Buddhists 3-1. And so Rakhine nationalists who wanted to reclaim Rakhine only for the Buddhists, and the Burmese military that did not want the Rohingya population to grow, because in the military's false perception of threat, around 1960 the military began to see Rohingyas as potential or future proxies that Bangladesh would use. At the time it was East Pakistan. Bangladesh became independent only in 1971. So the military framed the Rohingyas as a threat to national security by virtue of the fact that they are Muslims, they have linguistic and cultural ties with the neighboring East Pakistani state at the time of Chittagong. And so this is not dissimilar to how the Nazi Party framed the Jews in Germany as viruses or scums. So this kind of genocidal language was put in circulation in the popular media with a greater frequency, from the state attempting to erase their identity, but they were never mentioned or referred to as Rohingya. There was a new vocabulary for them, Bengali. And even like Bengalis in Bangladesh, they all identify themselves around the world as Bangladeshi, because Bengal is like a two-part East Bengal and West Bengal. West Bengal is based around or centered around Kolkata, and they speak the same language, Bengali. East Bengal is around Dhaka. But in terms of their political citizenship, you've got West Bengalis who call themselves Indians. That's their political identity, and that's where they belong in terms of their citizenship. The East Bengalis, now Bangladeshi. Citizenship is Bangladesh, but they share the same common language of Bengali, but they have two different identities. And we don't accept the fact that Rohingyas may have linguistic similarities with Chittagonian, like 80% of their languages overlap. But that doesn't mean that they are the same people or they belong to the single nation state. So we impose the term, the ethnic identity, Bengali, on the Rohingya people who could establish their authentic identity as Rohingya based on primary historical sources. Yes, there have been movements of people, from Burmese side, from the Bangladeshi side, over centuries, and well into, say, 1950s and 60s, where commerce and trade took place across the border, where the Arakan coastline was still, relatively peaceful region. And so because of this threat perception by the Burmese military, that did not want the Rohingya population to grow, because of the Rakhine nationalist, like purist vision for Rakhine or Arakan, for the Buddhists themselves, they join hands together, these two social and forces, the military and the Rakhines, and they join hands together in the persecution of the Rohingya. So since 1978, there have been 5 major waves of state-directed, largely, attacks on the Rohingyas. So I'm going to skip quite a few slides, and then after this one, and then get to the important slide. So this was Burmese language official encyclopedia of Burma, where Rohingyas were officially recognized as an ethnic community. And the second slide, on one side is the page from this encyclopedia. The other side is national registration card. Yeah? And so these are artifacts that establish that Rohingyas are our own Burmese people. And this is my late great uncle, who was a deputy in charge of Rohingya civil administration. That's me, the enemy of the state, because I came from a Buddhist background and I have a large extended military family. Essentially 1 in every 4 male in my extended family is in different branches of the armed forces. Some are prominent, some are low level. And so because the young, the tall gentleman in the military uniform, he's number 3 in the entire food chain of the Burmese army. He is Joint Chief. He's considered a shoe-in for number 1 position. He's my contemporary. I used to, arrange what's called like track 2 diplomacy, like arranging meetings between, say, like the Burmese government and Western officials who want to figure out a way to basically, renormalize Burma relations. And so I know them personally. And then the guy next to me, a bit stout and short, he is currently the Vice President and former head of intelligence, and he chairs 2 consecutive commissions that whitewash the Army's conduct. He's the guy who signed off on the report that said the Burmese military has not fired a single shot that killed a Rohingya. And so this genocide is very personal to me, because a lot of my friends, either from the civilian side or the military side, they have been so instrumental in executing the genocidal plans. I talked about it. Okay, this was the first wave of genocidal terror, 1978. From the local newspapers, regional publications, and you change the bylines, copy, cut, and paste, republish it. You get exactly the same story. But in those days, in 1978, Burma was closed off from the outside world because we were under the military, in quote, socialist rule. The only difference is that in those days there would be no cameras, no Facebook, no Twitter, no mobile phone. People did not know. But what we witnessed over our mobile devices over the last 3 months had already happened 5 times in 5 large waves. Think about it. Amnesty International published a report saying that they live in dehumanizing apartheid conditions. Just like, I think last week, if you would, some of you be aware. After 2 years of study, I was a very proud member of Amnesty. When I first arrived in the US as a young student at the age of 25, as a graduate student, one of the very first things I did was I went to join the Amnesty, I would participate, very enthusiastically in the letter writing campaigns, because I came from Burma under dictatorship. Being a member of Amnesty, I was so proud that I was doing something that I was not allowed to do in my own country. But my question is where has Amnesty been? Because as early as July 1978, a regional news outlet ran a story, Burma's brand of apartheid. So that was almost 40 years ago. Media organization recognized the situation as apartheid. And Amnesty just came up with it a week ago. Where has Amnesty been? That's my question. And okay, the slow burning genocide. I think what gripped the world's imagination and what shocked the people is these quote unquote mediagenic atrocity. Like a woman crying on camera, telling stories of their babies being snatched from them and being tossed into the burning houses. Witnessing husbands being beheaded or being slit in their throat. That's the kind of things that that is what has led to UN and other organizations to call this a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. But much more, equally ominous and equally atrocious to me is the fact that Burma has imposed conditions designed to make life unsustainable for Rohingyas. When we say Rohingya villages, it's actually the normal vocabulary in a genocidal situation becomes quite misleading. Because in a village, or if we use the word village or city, we are led to believe that people go about their business of raising children, going to a clinic, going to a grocery store, or farming or fishing. That's not the case. Rohingya villages are essentially open, vast prisons. The Rohingya community, Rohingya areas are organized as a web of security grids. And there will be checkpoints. Last year, October 2016, the Physicians for Human Rights came up with a report that mapped out the security guards in relation to village clinics of around 150 villages. They came, so what they found was that, a Rohingya person, whether a pregnant woman or old man, could not walk from village A to village B, where there will be a semblance of a clinic. No doctor. I'll get to that. And then, after the next two slides, I'm going to conclude my talk. The Physician for Human Rights found that, on average, for a young pregnant woman or a frail old man to get to the next village, he would have to go through, or she would have to go through, 2 security checkpoints. Because their movements are so closely monitored by the Rohingya informers. But if you're in an impoverished and an extremely repressed community, you could always you will always have people who would inform for the, who would serve as an informer for the oppressor in exchange for a little more freedom, a little money, or blackmail to be monitoring or spying on your own community. This is important because this relates to the third trend of falsehood that we have observed, which is that there is a conflict, military conflict of sort going on. On one hand, there is the Burmese state actor the security forces, police, border guards, and field intelligence, village administrations, and whatnot. On the other hand, these like militant Rohingya group called like Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ASA, before they had an Islamic name, because that they have been like framed as like ISIS linked, receiving money from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So they changed the name to ASA, and they have been like repeatedly saying we have no interest in setting up Islamic State or and no caliphate. We just want to live in peace with full citizenship rights and basic human rights. So they've made their objectives known to the world through the media, writers, and others. But we have been told by a single source that gets repeated around the world by media organizations, including New York Times, Wall Street, CNN, and others, and writers, AP, you name it, that the current or the latest wave of attacks on Rohingyas was triggered by the Rohingya militants that stormed 20 or 30, I'm not sure, like it depends on like who's speaking, all these numbers. Let's say like 3,000 young men bearing, primitive farm tools like machetes and spears and a few homemade grenades and a few like weapons they looted from isolated security units. The story that continues to feed into policy discussions in Ottawa or Washington and others is that Rohingya militant groups are in armed conflict with the powerful Burmese military, and the Rohingya community, men, women, children, elderly people, are caught in this conflict. And the Burmese military has responded with the disproportionate force and violence. And so this is crucial, because if we use the conflict narrative, it obscures the real fact that the state actor has been engaged in a slow process of genocide with periodic spikes of mass violence. And so the reason I mentioned the security grid, the reason I cited the Physician for Human Rights report is this. This is a region where a single Rohingya individual cannot move from one village to the other, even to see a village nurse or a midwife, or to get aspirins, without being noticed, without being monitored. How is it possible that 3,000 young Rohingya, angry, desperate men, carrying unconcealed farm tools to attack 30 different outposts? I say maybe 5 outposts they managed to attack. 3,000 young men carrying these unconcealed weapons were allowed to attack these security outposts and kill 12 people. In return, what did you get? 700,000 survivors in a span of 3 months, and uncountable number of men killed. Only 60% of these survivors in Bangladesh today are women, children, and elderly people. The other 40% unaccounted for. Yeah? And so if you look at the statistics, it becomes so clear that this is not just simply structures of apartheid under which Rohingyas are forced to live. These are genocidal conditions induced by the policy intentionally. If you look at the doctor-patients ratio, national average is 1 doctor is to about 685, 700. For the Rohingya, 1 doctor is to 150,000. The infant mortality rate 4 times as high as any other ethnic groups. Yeah? malnutrition, 80,000 plus children under the age of 5, this is from World Food Program back in July this year, suffering from sub-Saharan like semi-famine situation. And this is a community, Rohingya, that had like vibrant cultural, intellectual activities, as university students, doctors, engineers, parliamentarians, bureaucrats. Today, the Rohingya community is 80% illiterate. Think about it. So these are results of policy-induced destruction of the Rohingya community, from the mind to the body, like they're deprived of opportunities to grow intellectually. And if you walk into a Rohingya village and ask them who's the community leader, no one would dare raising their hand. The minute you raise your hand as a community leader, you are targeted. Yeah? So no one can lead your community. That is why, like, when people say like Rohingyas cannot, speak for themselves, or Rohingyas are so like disorganized, disunited. No, this is the result of 2 generations of systematic attempt to destroy this community, symbolically in terms of their identity, psychologically, denying that they belong to this place, to the body, the blow to the body, the weaken the body. If you go back and read the Raphael Lemkin's original article that kicked off this notion genocide, which crystallized into the convention in 1948, this is like systematic weakening. And when the weakening is not fast enough, the military resort to direct terror. That's direct killing. So today, the Burmese state, in my own considered opinion, is guilty of 4 out of 5 acts of genocide, defined in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. That's only legally speaking. Sociologically speaking, every single indicator, like a friend of mine, like Gregory Stanton, who came up with the stages of genocide, 10 stages, he would say every single genocidal element is present. And so finally, this is just simply the what you already know. Genocides, acts of genocide. Finally, the question of the intent. Lawyers would debate, whether there is the intent behind this, or there is just simply crimes against humanity, laundry list of crimes that are being committed against the Rohingyas. Well, I would say, if you are depriving a community of life's barest essentials, food, medicine, forget the schooling, and forget that cultural stuff. If you make sure that this community does not have access to adequate nutritional opportunities, over time, this community, biologically dies off. This is institutionalized and slow killing. That is why my wife and I, who co-authored this piece, we call this the slow burning genocide. And Amartya Sen, speaking in support of our conclusion, said, well, just call it slow genocide. No, I think slow burning, because it captures the nature of genocide. And what we just saw was direct killings. That is what captured the world's imagination. But what is much more ominous is decades of, this slow process of institutionalized killing. And then this is, if you don't call this genocide, I don't know what you will call a genocide. And I think we have enough information, we have piles of documentation, 4 independent studies, finally. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yale Law School, Queen Mary University Law School. These three major studies came after our first published study in 2014. We don't need one more special envoy. We don't need UN fact-finding mission. Facts are there. What is lacking is the political will. This is not a Muslim issue. This is not a Rohingya issue. This is a human issue. Before our eyes, people are dying. Babies are dying, and babies will die. And Bangladesh and Burma have just signed an extremely troubling repatriation deal. And so I think my appeal to you, and I'm speaking not simply as an academic or Burmese, I'm speaking only as a fellow human being. This is a situation that calls for R2P intervention. Canada has played a major role in birthing the notion of R2P. And it doesn't even have to be recognized as genocide. There are 4 things that can trigger R2P. The 3 international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. Even the Canadian government has called this ethnic cleansing. That means the government in Burma is an ethnic cleanser, and that government is nominally and de facto headed by Aung San Suu Kyi. And the least Canadian government can do is put moratorium on any forms of bilateral relations, assistance, cultural ties, except humanitarian assistance. And so I think you cannot call a state actor ethnic cleanser and tell your own Canadian citizens, oh, we're going to give Aung San Suu Kyi more time. Aung San Suu Kyi is part of this genocide. She is not just simply silent. She actually uses her moral and political power to dismiss, deny, and whitewash what her partners in power, the military, has been doing to this community. I think the amnesty here should write to Prime Minister Trudeau and express your grave concern and ask him to stop the rhetoric of supporting Aung San Suu Kyi for the democratic transition. No genocide in history has ever led to democratic transition. In the last, 100 years, since 1915's Armenian genocide in Turkey, all genocides led to, self-destructive regimes. And this is in this case, in my case, this situation is as bad as Rwanda, as bad as Srebrenica, actually even worse. Yeah? Because this is not just simply premeditated killing over 5 years. We are killing this community over 4 decades. And please, do everything in your power to end this, because 20 years down the road, this will be in the history textbooks. Burma Myanmar's genocide. And then your children, our children will ask you, Mom, Dad, did you know about this? What did you do? You have to answer. What did you do? Did you just simply write a letter? Or did you do something else? That will be, So anyway, I'm going to stop my talk now. I know I've gone over, but I didn't think I would have the energy. When I came in, I was really tired. But when I started talking about the survivor stories, it must have been their spirit that gave me the energy. I really was very tired. My jaws were tight. I've been talking in different cities. And so, but thank you for indulging me to talk this long. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Zarni. We are going to continue with the panel discussion and the Q&A session after this, but in the middle I think that we're going to bring in some refreshments so as to get some more energy. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Can you repeat that? I think it's going to be for the good for all.
the moratorium, they asked, you said, R2P, have a moratorium in place. Can you repeat those? I was noting them.
Well, put a moratorium on so-called democracy support or development assistance. Yeah? Because we have a genocidal situation, and this is a genocide that is directed top-down and executed with the collaboration of local Buddhist Rakhine nationalists, vigilantes. They have been, reportedly involved in sexual violence, burning hundreds of villages down, 288 to be exact, according to the Human Rights Watch satellite imageries. And the other is, I think even consider downgrading diplomatic relations, with Burma. Now, this has been done by the Americans, when Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest. And, she got so much support from around the world. One person under house arrest, living in a comfortable villa. She wasn't in a refugee camp for 15 years. I mean, like last night, one of the Rohingya brothers said he grew up in a refugee camp. And, he was denied of anything. So at the age of 7, he had to, he had normal opportunities to learn. And so we are talking about 1 million people. It's not about the numbers here. I mean that's one thing. I didn't make it clear. Genocides are never about the size of the community. It doesn't matter. In Srebrenica, 10,000 people were killed. That was considered that UN retroactively declared it genocide. Yeah? But in Cambodia, 1/3 of the population was wiped out between 1974 and 78, and that's about 40 years ago, and still UN has not called it genocide. They have a Khmer Rouge tribunal. It's known as the ECCC, Extraordinary Chambers of the Court of Cambodia. That's a hybrid UN and Cambodian government jointly run tribunal. And the tribunal has used over 300 million in its 9th or 10th year. And then, Cambodian genocide has not been officially considered genocide. But in the case of Myanmar or Burma's genocide, by the time judicial review is done to determine whether this constitutes a crime, the crime of genocide, or by the time the courts are involved, there will be no Rohingyas left inside the country. Already, there are the Rohingya diaspora are 4 times bigger than what's left inside. And the ones that are left inside, they also want to run. They don't want to, because the local vigilantes are coming to burn down my houses, mosques, as I speak today. And so I think, the key is the essence from the citizens to the Canadian government is that Canada cannot have business as usual with Burma. If we have identified a rapist on campus, if we have identified a murderer on campus, who will want to go and be friends with them? Why does Canada or Canadian government want to operate on the pretense that a country committing a genocide is going to self-correct itself and is on the path toward democracy and human rights under the leadership of Nobel Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, when the whole world has come to the sad conclusion she is complicit in this genocide. And so, say a downgrade diplomatic relations, meaning recall the ambassador and keep the charge in, minimize the staff there, and support the Rohingya refugees or survivors in Bangladesh. And if they're going to start repatriating them, Canada insists that repatriation is 100% voluntary, And the conditions on the ground in Rakhine or Arakan guarantee safe return, reintegration of Rohingya community, and full citizenship right. And that's very crucial. You cannot send 700,000 people who just fled the genocidal terror, saying like, in 2 months later, you have to go back there because like we inked a deal between the two states. Rohingyas must not be sacrificed once more again.
Maybe if I can make a comment.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. So I live in Oakville, and I went to see my MP, John Oliver, and so we mentioned a lot of things that you had mentioned, and we said that there should be sanctions, and we talked about the ridiculousness of the Canadian position, about we'll go and talk to the military and see if they can provide security for the Rohingya. It's ridiculous. I said to them, it's like asking Jack the Ripper to take care of a women's shelter, like, it's totally ridiculous, right? So John Oliver said, I have this letter and we want specific points, so we said, okay, we gave him these points and he added them. He's going to take them to Trudeau, but really, I really don't see, I'm so disheartened, I don't see any will in this government. And see, as far as I can see from history, a lot of these genocides occur because of resources, natural resources. I haven't seen one single case where, throughout history, so-called religion is not used as an excuse. It just seems to be the same pattern. And I'm just wondering how much of the resources are...
Yeah, I think the need to access the resources, the need to make sure the area is clear of any type of future conflict. I think that, of course, at this point in the process, they come into important play. But I would say this genocide started out, when Burma had no intention of joining the capitalist world economy. This started out in the 1960s. In fact, under the socialist military rule, and the regime withdrew from the world's economy. Isolated the entire society, and so in those days, the resource extraction was not affected. And so I will say there is a constant, rationale that has run throughout these 4 decades, which is motivated by, the false perception of Rohingyas as a threat, and the unwelcoming of the growth of a Muslim population. So religions, has played a major justificatory role as far as the Burmese military leadership. Yeah. But the economic dimensions and others, and also strategic dimension, get added to the original thing. And so, it becomes several rational threats now, insofar as the military planners are concerned. And also genocide actually, leaving aside compassion and the international law and norm and decency, genocide has been a major victory for the military, because this was a society only 5 years ago, before the last 2 or 3 waves of killing started in 2012. The society was demanding that the military amend the constitution so that fully civilian government can gradually take over, and that people were demanding greater press freedom, the greater speed in liberalizing the politics, and so now today, even a dissident who spent 15 years behind bars, or a dissident who were in exile like myself for 20 years, when they return, they all speak the same language as the military. So human rights defenders in Burma today, they talk about national security. They don't talk about human rights of the Rohingya. And they don't even respect, the rights of the Rohingya to call themselves in any manner they deem fit. And so, discourse has shifted, and this is a society that opposed this military regime, waves after waves of public protest, and even some took up arms. Today, the public is holding rallies in support of the military. The military has refashioned itself as the defender of Buddhism, Buddhist society. And so, that's another strategic rationale. And of course, in Rohingya areas, now reportedly the home for titanium and other natural resources. And the Chinese are there, Indians are there, so that's another geopolitics.
Thank you.
Yes, please, do it.
So a couple of us actually mentioned the responsibility to protect, which is more of a multilateral approach towards intervention there. Why aren't the nations which are more powerful around the region intervening directly? China comes to mind, India comes to mind, Bangladesh to an extent comes to mind. Why not a unilateral approach wherein the Rohingya, or at least somebody representing the Rohingya, go to the Indian government or the Chinese government and ask them to unilaterally impose on the
Well, China, China is one of the countries where human lives are not worth that much. And India is turning fascist. Most of you would know. In India of Prime Minister Modi is more concerned about cows than Muslim lives. Yes. And so, you knock out two major regional powers, but Japan has never exerted moral leadership, despite when it was the second largest economy. Japan never punched its weight. It never provided intellectual or moral leadership around the world in international affairs. It always rallied behind the United States. So Australia, Australian government's policy towards refugees, they militarized or securitized the refugee policies. Australia itself could be tried at ICC for what's doing in
The
islands. And so Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world. The largest Muslim population is in India, but as a nation state, UN member, Indonesia is the largest. But Indonesia consistently undermines any effort for punitive and effective punitive measures, even within the OIC, because Indonesia has set its eyes on the coal mines, opportunities to develop a cement industry in Burma, and also Indonesian military and Burma military have been so close, And then Pakistan, Pakistan is training the Burmese military. Yeah? Over the last, ISI trains the Burmese military intelligence officers. And so who are, Rohingyas, basically, Rohingyas are left with no real friends. Saudi Arabia, they bought $15 billion worth of arms from Canada. Everybody knows.
Yes.
And the projected need financially to keep this Rohingya population for another, 2 years, 1 year, 3 years, is $435 million US. And Saudi Arabia donated $12 million. That's 2 nights, fees for one of the princes partying. Think about it. It is beyond absurd, man. No fellow Muslim countries would come together. No liberal countries would mobilize their, human rights or R2P principle. The fact is, people look to UN Security Council. Well, as I said, Security Council has, for all intents and purposes, Security Council is dead. So we just have not had a funeral yet. Yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, because I quoted you on your critique of ever since the UN was created, genocides have succeeded, right? It seems that the whole nation-state system has allowed this whole nation-state system, and on top of it, you got the UN to handcuff these nations. So, for example, when the Bosnian genocide was taking place, I think Venezuela was became a temporary member of the Security Council, and they were pleading with the Security Council to intervene. And you know, the funny thing is, like, okay, the UN has been a party to the genocide. That's the biggest thing, because when the Bosnian genocide was taking place, the UN put a sanction. They did not allow the Bosnian state to defend themselves. They were going against their own UN, law of, every sovereign union member state has the right to defend itself. They were not allowing it to defend itself. Therefore, the genocide was taking place. With Myanmar, they know the atrocities are taking place, but they're still supporting Burma. So it's just so warped. It's so absurd. What's been happening? Yeah. But anyways.
Let me take that
Yeah,
one.
yeah, go ahead.
I guess to add to that, and the theme of the last few questions, obviously the priority coming out of this whole situation is to ensure that the Rohingya people have justice done on their part. But following that, unfortunately, it takes these kind of horrendous scenarios to really shed light on the greater, problems of the system as a whole, like what is required to classify something as a genocide and why certain events throughout history still haven't been. I'm just curious as to whether or not you believe that this most recent incident with the Rohingya people will be enough to sort of re-simulate that conversation around restructuring how we deal with these issues. Like,
I don't know. I mean, I'm when it comes to restructuring UN system, I think there is zero chance of like reforming the Security Council. You cannot. I mean, like Western governments cannot go around and promote democracy when they preside over a completely undemocratic system. I mean, 5 countries. So it's like if Security Council is not there, if this issue is voted, then I mean overwhelmingly there will be nations that say, okay, never mind U.S., China, and India. The world community must act. In other words, intervene forcibly to end the atrocities. Yeah? It would have happened, and I think like a week or so ago, the General Assembly adopted, or like one of the committees adopted, with overwhelming member state support, to call for the Burmese state granting Rohingyas blanket citizenship. Yeah? And that's, and then look, I mean, we're living the 3rd month of, mass exodus, the frequency and the scale of the people fleeing have subsided, but the best that UN Security Council could do is not even non-binding resolution adopted by, say, like, a majority on the Security Council, without the veto. It could only come up with a presidential statement. Yeah. Okay, we condemn this, that. But so, like, then even then, like in the case of like Palestine, you talk about whether the UN system works or not. I mean, Israel has ignored over 240 or 50. I lost track of like how many resolutions. Israel just simply, thumb its, nose, and so it's not working. I mean, like Burma has like a double. The killers have double impunity. The impunity from within the Burmese state, and the impunity from outside. Yeah.
Just, I know this is a huge question that can't be answered in the next 5, 10, or even, 20 minutes. But I guess it kind of all comes back down to what's next, because I understand we need to do something, but it requires a sense of long-term thinking a lot of times to really understand what you're working towards in order to do something. And so if these systems aren't working, what is it that we can go for? What is it that we can advocate for to begin rectifying these different problems?
Well, I think like there has to be a coalition of governments that are concerned about the situation genuinely, and and find a way outside the UN system. Because I mean, if you look at all the wars that have been launched by the United States and allies since, say, like the first Iraq War or the second Iraq War, Libya, Syria, other places, I mean, like if it is in their interest, if it serves the interest of the intervening power, they don't go to the Security Council to ask for authorization because they see Security Council as an obstacle, so they bypass Security Council and bomb any country they want. And so, like, it's so clear that saving lives is never a profitable business. It doesn't serve anyone's strategic interest.
So I was going to comment on that. I don't want to hog the Q&A here. Yeah, because in my writings I used to talk about, probably how the UN could be reformed, right? And then, I've come to the conclusion that the UN has been an obstacle because a lot of the wars, as you said, so if a nation wants to go for war, for rightly or wrongly, and I think mostly it's wrongly, the reasons are wrong, where they bypass this UN Security Council, they can do it. They do it. For example, when Canada had followed America's lead in invading Afghanistan after 9/11, that was outside the UN Security Council. Then the UN came in after with a mandate to stabilize the nation. But initially, the attack was where they bypassed the UN, right? So I think we got our priorities wrong in the world. And what's happened is that with nations that do want to do something, they're psychologically psyched that it has to be UN approved. So I was talking about the case of Venezuela when the Bosnian genocide was taking place. Venezuela had pleaded, because at that time they became a temporary member of the Security Council. They were pleading with the Syrian Security Council to lift the arms embargo on Bosnia because this was curtailing them to stop genocide, and they weren't. Now, just imagine if there was a world without the United Nations. And if there is a if there's a nation or a group of countries that want to help stop a genocide, they can freely do it. They don't have to be psychologically psyched by a United Nations organization, right?
Yeah.
And I think it would be better that the UN does go. But
one thing that when you look at it from a country perspective, you do get that sometimes helpless feeling. But it's really important to look at yourself as individuals and what you can do. That's what you have control over. And you shouldn't really get that, hopeless kind of feeling. Write to your representatives, be outspoken, keep sharing stuff on social media, keep speaking about what's going on. Speak to your local media, have them cover the stories. If you're good with producing videos, making YouTube videos, we are planning certain things, even in discussion with Toronto City Councillors and other MPs that are champions of the cause. I mean, you got to remember that as an institution, the UN might be, let's say, useless, but there are still good people that work inside the UN. There are champions of this cause, even within our government, people that do care. So, we have to work together and do what we can, and, we don't control countries, we control each other, we control ourselves. So, that's what we have to put your effort towards and see where the chips fall.
I mean, like two things that are practical within your power is maybe approach the student government here and say you want the student government to pass a resolution recognizing as the plight of Rohingya as a case of genocide, and then include a call to Justin Trudeau and his cabinet to put a moratorium on the bilateral development assistance, with the exception of humanitarian assistance, downgrading, all the concrete things Canada can do without consulting with any governments around the world. Unilaterally, Canada can do a lot of things. Yeah? And also, maybe even consider setting up Rohingya studies program, things like that. You know what I mean? And the things that will have lasting value, after the dust settles. I mean, there are a lot of things. And the other one is like, because I think like we don't have a lot of time for the Rohingya in terms of the genocide, and they had, it's almost like completed. And so we don't have time to mobilize the entire Canadian society, and also like, there are many Rohingyas living in this country, in terms of the votes that the politicians would want, unlike say other communities. And so I think like you need to speak with and speak for the Rohingyas here, and maybe like identify the most powerful parliamentary body, or the most powerful cabinet minister, or strategically placed individuals, and target them for lobbying. Like if Human Rights Council is not that powerful, then like target Foreign Affairs committee in the Parliament, and you would know like who serves on that committee, and I'm sure like within your circle, friends and family, there will be people who can pick up the phone and call them. Sorry, I meant you say something.
We have to leave.
Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, yeah. Otherwise, I'll have to buy a fresh ticket. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And this has been.